Evening, everyone. This is Don Franco 3 with RPG Bones in the Witching Hour. Okay, just kidding. It's not a radio show, but anyway, I'm Don Franco 3. This is the Witching Hour. Uh, we do this during the Witching Hour because that's when supernatural things happen. And as I mentioned before, this late at night, I am the undead. So I might be able to click on my camera here in a second. Otherwise, it's just going to be voice. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the Morgoth way, at least the way Galadriel says it on Rings of Power. Um, the reason we're going to talk about this, well, actually, before we jump into that, I wanted to go over something that I talked about last time, which was XP pool. Now, if you remember, I said that when you're killing monsters, you can put all those experience points, like let's say you want to advance your characters and you want to give them experience points. You can take all those monsters. It doesn't matter who kills what monsters. You take that XP and you throw it into a pool and you just add it all together. And then depending on your method, I prefer to just have my players leveling up all the time because I don't think it's a big deal considering most groups don't really last too long. You know, we're talking 7 to 15 sessions maybe. We know there's those long-time lifers out there that have been with their groups forever, but that's just kind of a rare thing. So I like to just give my players experience points and let them level up. So I decided that, you know, the other thing I talked about during that video was giving XP for skill checks. But what I didn't talk about is like how much XP should all the skill checks be? Like how do you determine how much XP you should give out for those skill checks? So then I kind of decided to calculate experience points based on DC and multiplying it. Initially it was, you know, multiplied by log 5 because I wanted to make sure that the higher the XP, it should be exponentially harder because essentially at the higher levels, it's much harder to gain a level. But, you know, that's not always true for different types of systems. So I created a, you know, take a DC, times it by 2. And then once you do that the first time, for like example, that very first example, there's DC 5 times 2 equals 10. That would be 10 XP for a DC check of 5. But then you take that 10, and when you go to DC 10, you multiply that 10 by 2. And then you kind of continue to multiply that number by 2, just doubling in that number essentially until we get to this DC 30 check where you would get 320 XP. That didn't really seem to be a lot, but I guess that is one method. So what I'm showing you on the right is XP charts for the 2014 Player's Handbook, which is essentially identical to what you see is in 2024. And the blue chart below on the right is the Tales of the Valiant experience points chart. And you can see that is essentially identical. So it looks like maybe the DC times 3 here on the bottom left is probably the best way to go. Because at least this 6,000 wouldn't completely overwhelm the boundaries that's needed to advance levels in Dungeons and Dragons or any 5e compatible system, basically using this experience points table. You can't see though, you know, I guess if you really wanted to advance your players, you put the DC times 5 here chart here, but I don't think that's a little too much, right? I mean, how often are you doing a DC 30 check? That's one thing you need to consider. That's an impossible check. And so it would make sense that it should be really high, but this is a little high. So maybe the middle ground might even be a DC 4. You know, devise your own method, but this is essentially a way, you know, a lot of times I show these things because I just want to inspire other dungeon masters, game masters out there to kind of come up with their own ideas. Or they can take these and manipulate them, use them however they want. You know, back shout out, if you ever go live streaming to me is a really good plus. Always, you know, cite your sources. The other thing I wanted to talk about was DC and XP gained for Shadow Dark. Now, if you guys know, I mentioned it before, Shadow Dark, the XP between levels 1 and 10, because they don't go beyond 10, increase by 10 XP. So level 1 is 10. So basically, if you multiply the level, that would be how much XP you need for that level. So level 1, 2, 3, 4 is 10, 20, 30, 40, and so forth to 100 for level 10. And so I think because those XP points are so low, it would make sense to just give a direct XP to DC check and put that in the pool. For Pathfinder, it's a little more tricky because Pathfinder, I didn't realize it at the time, but Pathfinder essentially, well, I should say Shadow Dark mirrored what Pathfinder did, which is once you get to 1000 XP in Pathfinder, it drops back down to 0, and then every time you gain a level, it's gaining 1000 XP. You need 1000 XP to gain a level, and it continuously drops to 0, which is similar to what Shadow Dark's with its 10. It drops to 0, 20, then to 0, 30, then to 0. Obviously a little bit harder, I guess you would argue, in Shadow Dark. But for Pathfinder, I would say take those DC numbers, maybe just multiply them by 2 or 3, just straight up. Not the way I'm doing it here, where I kind of do this fake log power thing, but basically take a DC 15 and give it 30, or make it 45, depending if you're going to times it by 2 or times by 3. And that's pretty much it I wanted to talk about for the skill check XP pool, a method to calculate XP and give that XP out every time somebody makes a check. Now, I realize some players are always going to want to make a bunch of rolls to get that XP. You as a DM, that's part of it. You just kind of have to direct the group and say, no, you can't do that. Now, let's get to what I really wanted to talk to today, which was the Morgoth way. And I wanted to talk about this because it relates to the monster ecology video, because I really do ground a lot of my world building, map building, regional building, based on the amount of monsters that are there, like the critical monsters, right? The ones that are competing with you, and the apex predators. The other ones you can kind of just fluff in and throw them in whenever you want. Now, I wanted to show a problem that D&D has, which is essentially way too many races, okay, or species, however you want to call them. Here's actually just a short list of the number of species, right? So now if we start thinking about that monster ecology, one thing I mentioned in a previous video is, in order for any species to survive, or any race to survive, or just group of monsters to survive, you need a minimum of 500 to 1000 of that species to thrive, assuming they're following the genetic methods or the genetic biology that we also suffer through ourselves. You need a minimum of 500 to 1000 to have a thriving civilization or a thriving group of species. Excuse me. So when we start thinking about this level of monsters, and how are you gonna fit all these different species into one area? Especially, this is the minimum, 500 to 1000. In some cases, these civilizations are vast and huge. We're talking about millions. The US alone is pushing somewhere 366 million when you think about it. And this issue with all these different races has become a problem with, even, I don't know if it's a problem yet, but even Shadow Dark is starting to increase the number of monsters and the number of race or ancestries, as they call them. Remember, in Shadow Dark, there's already 270 monsters in the core book alone. Now we're looking at Western Reaches. They're going to add much more monsters. There's going to be 8 more ancestries. And if we're looking at the stuff that roll for combat, okay, I'm not discouraging anybody from getting this stuff, by the way. I love expansion material, and of course I know that you can pick and choose what you're going to use. But it's just something to think about in terms of trying to fit all these monsters into your world, and especially when you're trying to build that map. So, and you can see here that in the new Roll for Combat Shadow Dark Secret Tome books, there's going to be 3 of them. It says right there, 100 to 150 award-winning monsters per book. Okay, so we're talking, let's just keep it on the low end. We're talking another 300 monsters, so 270 plus 300. plus the monsters you're going to get out of the cursed scrolls. We're talking about a lot of monsters here that you're going to try to cram into your world. Now, you're obviously not going to use them all the time, but again, it's just something to consider about. Is there going to be, you know, core monsters? And here's just another list of a bunch of other Shadowdark related Kickstarter campaigns that are out there. Again, it's starting to push into this realm of tons and tons of different monsters and ancestries and species, or playable species and ancestries and whatnot, races. And so when I think about all these different monsters, I really start thinking about the father of all Dungeons and Dragons, any RPG system, and that's Tolkien, right? I think he was legit the first. If there ever was a definition of a dungeon master, a game master, what we do, Tolkien represents the original and a leading example of how we should consider our world building. Now, you guys probably know he developed the Elvish language on his own. He was writing, created dwarf writings. He thought about this stuff for years before it became published. And even a lot of the books that were eventually published through his son, though all that work that he had done just took years and he never completed it. And so, but truly the first dungeon master, world creator, obsessed with all these different things. And one way he went around the idea of how do you have more monsters and species and races out there in your world? How do you do that? They don't just naturally occur. So what happens in his books, you guys have probably all heard of Sauron, but less people hear about Morgoth, because Morgoth was actually a very powerful angel-like being. He came to Middle Earth and wreaked tons of havoc, and it really took tons of the higher up angels of Middle Earth to stop him and his dragons and his Balrogs. This guy was a machine. So how do you devise a way to normalize all these different races and species and monsters? Well, you have to find a way to say, in order for these species, they may exist in my world, but there's limited numbers of them, right? So we have to think about who are dominating monsters. Elves, I consider, humans monsters. So this is kind of the way I think about these things, because humans actually in our real world are the monsters. So in D&D or any RPG system, any humanoid species are monsters. So we got to think about who are the dominating monsters in your world. Who are other core creatures, the ones that are obeying the laws of genetics to survive, going to the 500 to 1000 of each of those monsters. And then who was actually created, right? So it can be anywhere between 1 to 499. We're just talking the genetic limits here, but you can also argue that these species were once created and then became a thriving civilization. But the point is, you need a way to, how did these species come about, right? How do we get a plasmoid? What the hell is that? A warforged. We know those guys were created. A centaur, shifter, Vyoshino, Gith, all these different species were all potentially created or magical accidents of some type of great powerful wizard. And so this is just another tool for your world building. Think of Morgoth, think of the Morgoth way, think of why so many of these different species exist in your world. And ultimately, looking at this, who are going to be your dominating monsters, your core creatures, and those that were created. It could be a group of wizards, the way Dungeons and Dragons, there was a core group of wizards that really are the founding fathers, right? Bigsby, Mordenkainen, and so forth. Think about that for your world building. Quick check on the chat box. Apologies for not having the video up, but this is RPG Boons, the Witching Hour. I did not see any ghosts today. Didn't even hear any weird noises. I am undead because it is the witching hour. Thank you for stopping by. See you next time.